Some rooms were never built for certain people, and everyone inside them made sure you felt it. She had spent years learning how to carry herself through spaces that tolerated her presence without ever truly welcoming it, meeting cruelty with composure and dismissal with quiet grace. On the evening of the Hargrove Summer Ball, the grandest social occasion Newport had seen in a decade, she had braced herself for the usual indifference. What she had not prepared for was being told to leave, or for the moment the most powerful man in the room stood up, looked across the gilded crowd and said, "She's with me." Newport, Rhode Island had its own particular cruelty, polished to a shine so bright it could blind you before you realized you were bleeding. In the summer of 1891, the cliffs overlooking the Atlantic became the seasonal theater of America's wealthiest families. The Hargroves, the Delfields, the Ashworths, each competing to host the most extravagant dinners, the most envied guest lists, the most talked-about balls. By August, the cottages, as they were absurdly called despite their 40 rooms and marble foyers, glittered from every hilltop like a string of jewels worn by someone who needed everyone to notice them. The ocean breeze carried the scent of hothouse flowers and French perfume, and the particular satisfaction of people who had never once doubted their right to exist exactly where they stood. Nora Caldwell had always stood somewhere slightly to the left of all of it. At 38, she was neither poor enough to be entirely dismissed nor wealthy enough to be genuinely accepted, occupying that uncomfortable middle ground that society reserved its most subtle cruelties for. Her father had been a respected professor of literature at Brown University, a man of considerable intellect and considerable impracticality, who had left his family upon his death with a full library and an almost empty bank account. Nora had done what women of her circumstances did when the alternatives were few. She had made herself useful. She ran a small but well-regarded lending library on Thames Street in Newport, the kind of establishment that the summer families occasionally patronized when the weather turned too gray for outdoor entertainments, flipping through her carefully curated shelves with the mildly surprised expressions of people who had not expected to find quality in such a modest setting. They borrowed her books. They did not invite her to dinner. She had understood the distinction for a long time. The understanding did not make it painless, but it had made her efficient at calibrating her expectations, at finding genuine pleasure in the smaller perimeters of her life, at building a world within the world that excluded her that was nonetheless worth inhabiting. She had her library, her correspondence with writers and publishers whose names carried weight in rooms she would never enter, her Sunday walks along the cliff path when the summer people were still sleeping off their Saturday evening champagne. It was a life. She had told herself often enough that she almost believed it enough. Her brother, Daniel, disagreed. Daniel Caldwell had done what Nora had not. He had climbed. Through a combination of sharp business instinct and a fortunate partnership with a Philadelphia railroad man named Whitmore, Daniel had in the space of 10 years transformed himself from a schoolteacher's son into a man whose name appeared in the financial columns of the Providence Journal. He was not old money, and Newport's established families were not yet prepared to forget that distinction, but he had acquired enough of the new kind to be cautiously, conditionally received. An invitation to the Hargrove Summer Ball had arrived at his door 3 weeks prior, a minor miracle he attributed to a well-timed business introduction and Evelyn Hargrove's perpetual need for capital-adjacent conversation at her tables. He had, without fully consulting her on the wisdom of it, included Nora's name on his acceptance. She had argued against it with the quiet persistence of someone who had made peace with a truth her brother refused to accept. She did not belong in those rooms. Not because she lacked intelligence or grace or conversation. She possessed all three in quantities that would have served her well in any company, but because belonging was not simply a matter of what you carried inside you. It was a matter of what the room had already decided about you before you walked through the door. Newport's ballrooms had decided about Nora Caldwell long ago. She was the woman who lent you books. She was not the woman you stood beside at a Hargrove ball. Daniel had dismissed her objections with the breezy confidence of a man whose recent financial successes had temporarily convinced him that the old rules no longer fully applied. And so she had come. She had worn her best dress, a deep navy silk she had purchased 2 seasons prior for her cousin's wedding in Providence. Simple in its construction but well cut enough to pass without embarrassment. She had arranged her dark hair, now threaded at the temples with the first fine lines of silver, with more care than she usually permitted herself. Standing before the narrow mirror in Daniel's rented cottage that evening, she had studied her reflection with the measured, unsentimental gaze she applied to most things, noting the fine lines at the corners of her eyes, the quality of her posture, the face that was handsome without being striking, intelligent without announcing itself. She had decided like exactly what she was, a woman who read too many books and smiled too rarely at the right people, and had somehow arrived at 38 without having mattered very much to the world that surrounded her. She had pressed her lips together, smoothed the front of her dress, and gone downstairs to meet her brother. The Hargrove estate blazed with light from every window as their carriage rolled up the long drive, the sound of the orchestra drifting down through the warm August air. Nora had looked up at the illuminated facade and felt, beneath the careful composure she wore like a second garment, the faint and familiar ache of someone approaching a door they already knew would not quite open for them. She had been right about that. She simply had not anticipated what would happen next. The Hargrove ballroom was precisely what Newport had spent all summer promising it would be. Enormous floral arrangements of white peony and trailing ivy anchored every corner, their fragrance competing pleasantly with the beeswax candles burning in twin chandeliers that sent warm, shifting light across the assembled company below. The orchestra occupied a raised platform at the far end of the room, producing the kind of music that suggested elegance without demanding attention, a backdrop against which the real performance, the careful navigation of social hierarchy, could proceed uninterrupted. Women in Worth gowns and Tiffany diamonds moved through the room with the practiced ease of people who had been rehearsing this particular scene since childhood. Their escorts followed in dark evening coats, exchanging the firm handshakes and measured pleasantries of men conducting business in the language of leisure. Nora took it all in from just inside the entrance and felt the familiar sensation of watching a play from the wrong side of the stage. Daniel had been absorbed almost immediately. A hand on his elbow, a familiar voice, the particular magnetic pull of a business conversation disguised as small talk. He had glanced back at her with a look that was half apology and half encouragement before disappearing into the current of guests, leaving Nora to navigate the room with the quiet self-sufficiency she had long since made her default. She had done this before. Not here, not in a room quite this grand, but she understood the mechanics of being peripheral in a crowded space. You moved with purpose even when you had none. You kept your expression pleasant and unhurried. You found a position that was neither so prominent as to invite scrutiny nor so marginal as to advertise your isolation. She located such a position near a pair of French doors that opened onto the east terrace, where the ocean air provided a sensible reason to linger that had nothing to do with social inadequacy. From there, she observed. She had always been a gifted observer. It was, she supposed, an inevitable development in someone who had spent more years watching life than participating in its more celebrated forms. She noticed the way Mrs. Hargrove worked the room with the strategic precision of a general commanding a familiar battlefield, dispensing attention in carefully calibrated quantities. She noticed the younger women arranged in subtle constellation around the most eligible men present, the choreography so well practiced it had ceased to be visible to those performing it. She noticed the particular geometry of exclusion, the way a group could close itself without anyone appearing to move. What she did not immediately notice was the man standing at the opposite end of the terrace doors. He had positioned himself as she had, slightly apart from the main body of the room, though in his case the separation read not as marginality but as choice, the distinction being, she reflected, entirely a matter of what the room had already decided about you. He was tall, dark-haired, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that had been arranged by genetics into strong, angular lines that stopped short of conventional handsomeness and arrived instead at something more interesting. A face that suggested thought, and perhaps a certain impatience with things that did not merit it. She recognized him a moment after she registered him. Everett Ashworth. The Duke of Ashworth, to be precise. A title that sat oddly against the American landscape but was entirely legitimate, inherited through his grandmother's English lineage and reinforced by an education at Oxford and a decade spent managing the family's considerable Anglo-American interests. He was, by any reasonable measure, the most consequential person in the room, wealthier than the Hargroves, better connected than anyone present, and possessed of the kind of quiet authority that required no announcement because the room had already organized itself around it without being asked. He was also, she recalled from what little she knew of him, notoriously difficult. Not unkind, precisely, but exacting. A man whose standards were sufficiently high that few people troubled themselves to meet them, finding it easier to simply admire him from a comfortable distance and populate the gap with speculation. Nora returned her gaze to the room. It was the books that undid her composure. She had noticed them earlier in the evening, arranged on a side table near the terrace doors. A small collection, presumably decorative, of the kind of volumes that wealthy households displayed to suggest cultivation without necessarily pursuing it. Her professional instincts had catalogued them automatically. 2 volumes of Washington Irving, a collection of Emerson, and tucked at the end, slightly out of alignment with the others, a copy of Sarah Orne Jewett's The Country of the Pointed Firs, published just 3 years prior and not yet widely circulated in Newport's drawing rooms. She had reached for it without thinking, the automatic reflex of someone whose hands had spent more time among books than anywhere else, and was turning it thoughtfully in her fingers when a voice spoke from directly beside her. "That one doesn't belong with the others." She turned. Everett Ashworth was looking not at the book but at her, with an expression of mild, genuine curiosity that she had not anticipated from a man whose reputation suggested he found most things mildly, genuinely tedious. "No," she agreed, because she was constitutionally incapable of pretending she had not noticed what she had clearly noticed. "It's too recent and too honest for this particular shelf. Someone brought it in from elsewhere. It didn't start here." Something shifted almost imperceptibly in his expression. A fractional adjustment, as though a variable he had assigned a predictable value had returned an unexpected result. "You've read it," he said. "I stock it," she replied. "I lend books. On Thames Street." He was quiet for a moment, his gaze steady in a way that most people's wasn't, not the performed attention of social obligation, but the actual thing, directed at her with an evenness that she found simultaneously unsettling and, against all reasonable expectation, a relief. "What does it tell you?" he asked. "About a room, when the most interesting thing in it has been placed on a shelf no one looks at?" Nora set the book down carefully. She had answered questions about books 10,000 times. She had never before had the distinct sensation that the question was not entirely about the book. "It tells me," she said, after a moment that she kept deliberately unhurried, "that the people arranging the shelf had priorities other than the books themselves." He looked at her for one beat longer than the conversation required. Then the orchestra shifted into a livelier reel, a ripple of movement passed through the ballroom, and someone called his name from across the room. A sharp, socially insistent sound that carried the full weight of a person accustomed to being answered. He turned toward it with the controlled patience of a man who had long since made his peace with being perpetually sought. But before he moved, he glanced back at her once, briefly, and with an attention so focused it felt almost like a question left unfinished. Then he was gone, absorbed into the glittering current of the crowd, leaving Nora with her hand still resting lightly on the spine of the Jewett novel and the peculiar, unwelcome awareness that the evening had just become something other than what she had prepared herself for. The morning after the Hargrove ball, Newport woke early and talked fast. It was the nature of a resort town in high season that information traveled at a speed inversely proportional to the leisure its inhabitants pretended to be enjoying. By the time the summer families had finished their breakfasts and descended to their cliffside lawns and oceanfront terraces, the previous evening had already been disassembled, examined, and reassembled into a dozen competing narratives. Most of those narratives concerned the usual currency of seasonal gossip, who had danced with whom, which alliance appeared to be cooling, which debutante had made a favorable impression on which family's eldest son. One narrative, however, moved with more urgency than the rest. Everett Ashworth had been seen in conversation with the Caldwell woman. Not the brother, the sister, the one who ran the lending library on Thames Street. They had spoken for several minutes, which was notable in itself, since Everett Ashworth was not known for spending several minutes on anything that did not command his genuine interest. More notable still was the manner of the exchange. Not the polite, glancing attention a man of his standing might extend to any acquaintance of a business associate, but something more deliberate, more focused, the kind of attention that people on the periphery of the ballroom had registered without quite being able to name. By mid-morning, the narrative had acquired the embellishments that distance and imagination reliably supplied. Nora was aware of none of it when the delivery arrived at the library just after 10 o'clock. She had opened the shop at her usual hour, grateful for the familiar weight of routine after the previous evening's uncomfortable excursion into someone else's world. She was cataloging a new shipment of volumes from her Boston supplier, unwrapping each one with the particular care she gave to things she genuinely valued, when her assistant, a young woman named Bess, appeared in the doorway between the front room and the back with an expression caught precisely between excitement and the effort to appear professionally composed. "There's a messenger outside," Bess said. "From the Ashworth cottage." Nora set down the book in her hands with more deliberateness than the action required. The package the messenger carried was slim and rectangular, wrapped in brown paper and tied with a length of dark ribbon that managed to look both simple and expensive in the way that things belonging to very wealthy people often did. Inside, beneath the paper, was a first edition of Henry James's The Bostonians. Not a decorative copy, not a reprint, but a genuine first edition in exceptional condition, the kind that passed through her shop perhaps once a decade and that she had never once been able to afford to keep for herself. The note tucked inside the front cover was written in a clean, unhurried hand. "For someone who understands which books belong where. I thought this one belonged with you." Nora read it twice. Then she closed the book with the careful reverence it deserved, set it on her desk, and stood looking at it for a long moment in the quiet of the back room. She had enough professional experience to know exactly what a first edition James was worth. She had enough personal experience to know that men like Everett Ashworth did not send gifts of that caliber to women like her without a reason she had not yet identified. And she had enough hard-won self-knowledge to recognize the particular danger of allowing herself to assign the most generous interpretation to an action before she had sufficient evidence to support it. She wrote a brief, correct note of thanks and sent it back with the messenger. She did not expect that to be the end of it. She was right. He appeared at the library himself 2 days later, in the middle of a Tuesday afternoon when the shop held only 2 other patrons, a teenage boy browsing the adventure serials near the window and an elderly woman in the poetry section who was almost certainly asleep on her feet. Everett Ashworth walked through the front door of Nora's Thames Street Library with the same unhurried authority he had carried across the Hargrove ballroom, wearing a plain summer coat and no particular expression, as though visiting a lending library in the middle of a Newport Tuesday was something he had always intended to do and had simply waited for a suitable occasion. Bess, behind the front desk, made a sound that was not quite a word. Nora, emerging from the back room with an armful of newly catalogued volumes, stopped when she saw him. She recovered in the space of a breath. "Your Grace," she said, setting the books on the nearest shelf with practiced calm. "This is unexpected." "I prefer the unexpected," he replied, looking around the room with the same direct, evaluating the attention he had turned on her at the ball. "You've organized this by theme rather than alphabet." "Alphabet tells you nothing about what a book actually is," she said. "Theme tells you where it belongs." He looked back at her then, and something in his expression settled. Not softened precisely, but resolved, as though the answer had confirmed a conclusion he had been working toward. "I'd like to see your collection on American realism," he said. "If you'll show me." She showed him. He stayed for nearly 2 hours. By the following morning, the fact of his visit had covered Newport faster than the book itself could have been read. The story arrived at Nora's door through 3 separate channels before noon, through Bess, who had overheard 2 women discussing it at the baker's, through Daniel, who had received no fewer than 4 pointed inquiries at his club, and through a brief, carefully worded note from Mrs. Hargrove herself, which managed to express both social curiosity and mild alarm in the space of 2 polished sentences. The reactions that followed were as varied as they were predictable. Among Newport's established families, the dominant register was disbelief, shading quickly into suspicion. Everett Ashworth was not a man given to impulsive or inexplicable behavior, and his sustained interest in someone so conspicuously outside his social orbit demanded an explanation that the usual frameworks could not comfortably accommodate. Speculation filled the gap where understanding could not reach. A wager, some insisted. A peculiar whim suggested others. A deliberate provocation to the social order, proposed by the more dramatically inclined. Daniel, for his part, arrived at Nora's library on Wednesday morning wearing the expression of a man who had slept badly and thought too much. "Half of Newport is talking about you," he said, settling uninvited into the chair across her desk. "Then the other half will catch up shortly," she replied, without looking up from her accounts ledger. Nora. His voice carried the particular weight of someone trying to be careful with words they feared landing badly. I brought you to that ball because I thought it would be good for you to be seen. I did not anticipate you being seen quite this specifically. She set down her pen. Nothing has happened, Daniel. A man came into a bookshop and looked at books. That is what bookshops are for. Everett Ashworth does not go into bookshops. He did on Tuesday. Her brother studied her face with the searching attention of someone who had known her long enough to read what she did not say. And what do you make of it? Nora was quiet for a moment. Genuinely quiet. Not performing composure but actually sitting inside the question without rushing toward an answer she did not yet honestly have. I make nothing of it yet, she said finally, and it was true. I am not in the habit of building conclusions from insufficient evidence. Daniel looked unconvinced but said nothing further. He left an hour later, and Nora returned to her ledger, her pen moving steadily across the page while her mind moved with equal steadiness around the edges of a question she was not yet willing to examine directly. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, a second message arrived from the Ashworth cottage. It asked, in the same clean, unhurried hand, whether Miss Caldwell might be available to attend the Whitmore Garden lecture on Friday. A small, intimate gathering of perhaps 20 guests, focused on natural history and landscape design, the kind of event that occupied Newport's intellectual fringe while its social mainstream pursued more conventionally glamorous entertainments. It was, Nora understood immediately, a different kind of invitation than a ball. More deliberate, more revealing. A ball offered cover, a crowd, a context, a dozen plausible reasons for any two people to find themselves briefly in conversation. A small gathering of 20 offered none of that. It was a statement made in the quietest possible register, which somehow made it louder than anything that had preceded it. She sat with the note for a long time in the empty library after Bess had gone home for the evening, the late afternoon light moving slowly across the shelves around her. Then she wrote her answer. Yes. The Whitmore Garden was smaller than its reputation suggested, which turned out to be precisely its virtue. Tucked behind the main residence on Bellevue Avenue, it occupied perhaps 2 acres of carefully managed land, terraced beds of native wildflowers descending toward a stone retaining wall, beyond which the Atlantic glittered indifferently in the Friday afternoon light. The gathering itself was arranged on the upper lawn, where a modest cluster of chairs had been positioned before a low wooden lectern occupied by Professor Gerald Fenn of Yale, a botanist of genuine distinction who had the rare quality of speaking about his subject as though it had never once bored him and never would. There were exactly 19 other guests. Nora had counted them within the first 10 minutes, the automatic inventory of someone whose professional life had trained her to assess a room before committing herself fully to it. The company was quieter than the Hargrove Ball had been, less ornamented, more genuinely interested, the kind of gathering where conversation was pursued for its own sake rather than as a vehicle for positioning. She recognized a few faces. A retired judge and his wife from Providence, a marine painter whose work she had seen at a gallery on Spring Street, 2 women she knew vaguely as serious amateur naturalists who brought their field notebooks everywhere, and Everett Ashworth, who arrived 4 minutes after she did and took the empty chair beside her with the straightforward ease of someone who had reserved it in his own mind long before the event began. You came, he said, which was not quite a greeting and not quite an observation but something between the two. I said I would, she replied. He seemed to find this satisfactory in a way she did not entirely understand. Professor Fenn spoke for 40 minutes on the ecology of the Atlantic coastal landscape, the slow, patient intelligence of root systems, the way certain plants had evolved not to compete with their environment but to enter into a genuine negotiation with it, giving and taking in measures too subtle for casual observation to detect. Nora found herself genuinely absorbed. Beside her, she was aware that Everett listened with the same quality of attention she had noticed at the library. Complete, unhurried, the kind that processed rather than merely received. When Fenn opened the floor for questions, it was Everett who spoke first, asking something precise and technically informed about the relationship between soil composition and plant resilience that caused the botanist's face to brighten with the particular pleasure of a specialist encountering a non-specialist who had actually done the work. Nora glanced at him. You know botany, she said, quietly enough that only he could hear. I know a great many things that surprise people, he replied. with a dryness that was not quite humor but gestured toward it. After the formal lecture concluded, the guests dispersed across the garden in the loose, unhurried way of people with nowhere pressing to be. Nora moved toward the lower terrace, drawn by a bank of wild indigo she wanted to examine more closely. The deep blue-violet of the flowers was extraordinary against the gray of the stone wall, and she had a writer friend in Boston who would want to know the precise shade for a passage she was working on. She heard his footsteps on the stone path behind her and did not turn around immediately, giving them both a moment to arrive at what was coming next without the pressure of direct eye contact. Your friend the professor mentioned that coastal plants develop their strongest root systems not in spite of difficult conditions, but because of them, she said when he had drawn level with her. I've been thinking about that since he said it. What have you concluded? That it's either very comforting or very demanding, depending on where you're standing when you hear it. A pause. The ocean wind moved through the garden, carrying the salt-clean smell of the water below. Miss Caldwell, he said, and something in the directness of his tone told her this was a different register than the careful social language they had been exchanging. I owe you an honesty I have not yet offered. She turned to face him then. I did not come to the Hargrove ball with any particular intention, he said. I came because the Hargroves are useful to my family's interests, and declining their invitation would have cost more in social friction than attending it. I have attended 30 versions of that same evening in 30 different ballrooms over the past 15 years, and I have found them, without meaningful exception, to be the most efficient method yet devised for wasting time in expensive clothing. Despite herself, she felt the corner of her mouth move. That is very honest. What I have not yet been honest about, he continued, is why I sent the book, or why did I came to the library. He looked at her steadily. It was not courtesy, and it was not caprice. The wind moved between them again. Somewhere above on the upper lawn, two guests were laughing at something Professor Fenn had said. Then what was it? She asked. You said something at the ball, he replied, about the people arranging the shelf having priorities other than the books themselves. You said it simply and without performance, as a thing you had simply noticed and saw no reason to conceal. He paused. I have been in rooms full of clever people my entire adult life. Very few of them say what they actually think. The ones who do are almost always worth knowing. Nora was quiet for a moment, arranging her response with the care she gave to things that mattered. You say that as though knowing people is something you do rarely, she observed. Something shifted in his expression. Not dramatic, not a crack in a facade, but a subtle recalibration. The kind of adjustment a face makes when a question has landed somewhere undefended. I manage people, he said. I negotiate with them, employ them, occasionally disappoint them. Knowing them is a different matter. He looked out toward the water. My position tends to produce a particular kind of relationship. People show me the version of themselves they believe I want to see. After enough years of it, you stop expecting anything else. And you find that tolerable? She asked. He turned back to her. I find it efficient. That's not the same thing. He held her gaze for a moment before the faintest acknowledgement crossed his face. No, he said, it is not. They walked the length of the lower terrace in a silence that had grown comfortable enough to inhabit without filling. The late afternoon light was turning the stone wall amber, and the wild indigo threw long shadows across the path. Can I ask you something directly? Nora said. I would prefer it. Why does a man in your position, with every resource and connection available to him, spend his Friday afternoon at a garden lecture attended by 19 people, half of whom brought their own field notebooks? Everett was quiet for a beat longer than usual. When he spoke, his voice had lost the measured quality she had come to recognize as his social register, the tone he used when he was still, on some level, performing. Because, he said, it is the only invitation I received this week for something I actually wanted to attend. It was, she thought, perhaps the most unguarded thing she had ever heard a powerful man say in her presence. Not a confession of weakness, nothing so theatrical as that, but a simple, undefended truth, offered without apparent concern for what she would do with it. She did not treat it carelessly. The wild indigo is remarkable this season, she said, after a moment. My friend in Boston is writing a passage that needs exactly this color. I've been trying to find the right word for it all afternoon. Vespertine, he said without hesitation. She looked at him. Of or relating to the evening, he said. The color things turn just before the light changes completely. It's not quite blue and not quite purple. It belongs to a specific hour. Nora looked back at the flowers, then at the sky above the water, which had indeed begun its slow negotiation between afternoon and dusk. Vespertine, she repeated quietly. Neither of them moved to leave. 3 weeks after the Whitmore Garden lecture, Nora Caldwell had developed a new and inconvenient habit. She noticed things she had not previously noticed. The quality of light at 4 in the afternoon, when it came through the library's east-facing windows and turned the spines of the books along the far wall into something almost warm enough to touch. The way a particular silence in the back room felt different from the silence in the front. Denser, more private, more honest. The precise moment each morning when the sound of the street outside shifted from the early, purposeful sounds of working Newport into the looser, more performative sounds of the summer Newport that arrived later and stayed longer and occupied an entirely different city than the one she lived in. She noticed, with a clarity she would have preferred to avoid, that Tuesdays had become the day she moved through most carefully, the day Everett had first walked through her door, which had made every subsequent Tuesday carry a weight it had not previously possessed. He came again on the second Tuesday, and the third. Each visit followed its own particular shape, distinct from the others but constructed from the same materials: books, conversation, the unhurried exchange of ideas between two people who had separately concluded that unhurried exchanges of ideas were among the few things genuinely worth having. He had opinions that surprised her and gaps in his knowledge that surprised her more, and he received her corrections on both counts with the straightforward equanimity of someone who valued accuracy above the appearance of knowing everything. They disagreed, sometimes sharply, about Thoreau. He found self-sufficiency romantic to the point of self-deception. She found it more honest than most of what passed for realism. They agreed, with a mutual enthusiasm that arrived almost simultaneously, about the radical undervaluation of women writing in the American literary tradition. He had read more widely than almost anyone she had encountered, which was saying something given her profession, and he read the way she did, not to accumulate but to think. She recognized with the quiet dread of someone watching a carefully maintained structure develop its first fault line, in very serious trouble. She had not allowed herself to name it more specifically than that. Naming it would require admitting that it was real, and admitting it was real would require deciding what to do with it, and the options available to her when she examined them honestly were not comfortable ones. Everett Ashworth existed in a world that had specific and non-negotiable requirements for the woman who would share his name and his life. That woman would need to be many things that Nora was not and had no prospect of becoming. The alternative, whatever lesser arrangement might be proposed by a man of his position toward a woman of hers, was something she refused to consider at all. And so she continued, Tuesday by Tuesday, careful and honest and increasingly aware that careful and honest were not going to be sufficient armor against what was quietly building between them. It was on a Wednesday that it finally came to a point, which at least had the minor virtue of being unexpected. She had closed the library at 6 and was walking back along Thames Street toward the small house she rented 3 blocks north of the shop, carrying 2 books she intended to read that evening and the remnants of a thought about coastal root systems that had been following her since the Whitmore Garden and had not yet resolved itself into anything useful. She did not immediately register the carriage that slowed beside her on the street. The summer months brought enough traffic that a single vehicle moving at walking pace did not demand particular attention. Miss Caldwell. She turned. The carriage door was open. Everett sat inside it, his hat in his hand, which for reasons she could not immediately account for struck her as significant. I owe you an apology, he said. I have been arriving at your place of business on a weekly basis for the past month under the social cover of a professional interest in literature. That cover is accurate as far as it goes, but it does not go as far as the actual reason for my visits, and I find I am no longer comfortable with the discrepancy. Nora looked at him for a moment. The street moved around them, a cart, 2 women with parasols, a boy on a bicycle. I think, she said, you had better come inside. She meant the library. She unlocked it again, and they sat in the 2 chairs she kept in the back room for the afternoons when a reader needed somewhere quiet and there were no other options. The chairs faced each other across a low table stacked with unsorted arrivals, and the room smelled, as it always did, of paper and cloth binding and the faint mustiness of books that had been read by enough hands to absorb something of each of them. It was, she thought, the most honest room she knew. She was glad they were in it. "I have been trying," Everett said, "to approach this in the correct order, to give you time, to not press a case before I had demonstrated sufficient grounds for it. I have been counseled by people whose judgment I generally respect. I am proceeding with characteristic impatience." "Are you?" she asked. "I don't know," he said, with the particular candor of a man unaccustomed to not knowing things. "I know that I have not spent consecutive Tuesdays in the same location voluntarily since I was at Oxford, and the location was the Bodleian Library, which suggests that something worth examining is occurring. A beat. I also know that I have thought about a word you used at the Whitmore Garden, the way you said Vespertine back to yourself quietly, as though you were testing whether it was true, approximately 40 times since that afternoon, which I recognize is not a useful piece of information but is nonetheless an accurate one." The room was very quiet. Nora set her 2 books on the table between them with the precision of someone buying herself a moment inside which to be absolutely honest. "Everett," she said, using his given name for the first time without the formality of his title, and watching something in his expression respond to it before she had finished the word. "I am going to tell you something that I would like you to hear completely before you respond to it." "Yes," he said. "I am 38 years old," she said. "I run a lending library on Thames Street in Newport, which is not a fashionable occupation and will not become one. My father left me a love of books and no inheritance. I have no family connections that would be useful to you, no social position that would benefit your name, and no expectation of either of those things changing. I have spent the majority of my adult life in rooms that received me as an afterthought on the rare occasions when they received me at all, and I have made my peace with that because the alternative was to spend that same life in bitterness, which seemed like a worse use of the time." She paused. He had not moved. "I am telling you this," she continued, "not because I believe you are unaware of it, but because I need you to understand that I am aware of it, completely and without self-pity. I am not a woman who mistakes kindness for something larger than it is. I have done that once in my life and I learned from it thoroughly." She met his gaze directly. "So if what you are about to say to me is something that cannot sustain the full weight of those facts, I would ask you, with genuine respect, not to say it." The silence that followed was long enough to be real. When Everett spoke, his voice had the quality she had come to recognize as the register beneath his register, the one that appeared only when he had stopped managing the impression he was making. "I am 42 years old," he said. "I have spent the past 20 years managing an inheritance I did not choose, maintaining a position I was born into rather than earned, and negotiating a world that has never once asked me what I actually wanted from it because it assumed the answer was obvious." He leaned forward slightly, his forearms on his knees, his eyes on hers. "What I want, what I have wanted with increasing clarity over the past month, is a life that contains genuine conversation, genuine disagreement, genuine thought, and at least one person who will tell me, without performance or calculation, what they actually believe to be true." He reached across the low table, and his hand rested open on top of the unsorted books between them. Not grasping, not demanding, simply present. "I am not offering you kindness, Nora," he said. "I am asking you to consider a partnership between 2 people who are, I believe, better equipped to understand what that means than most people half our age. And I am asking you knowing exactly what you have just told me, not in spite of it." Outside, the street had gone quiet in the particular way of a summer evening settling into itself. The light coming through the library's small back window had gone the color of old gold, almost amber, the last of the day burning itself out slowly against the shelves. Nora looked at his open hand on the table. She looked at his face. She looked, for one long internal moment, at the whole architecture of the life she had constructed inside the careful limits she had accepted as permanent, and understood with a clarity that was almost physical that she was being offered the choice to decide, for the first time in a very long time, whether those limits were truly fixed or whether she had simply stopped testing them. She placed her hand in his. "I believe," she said quietly, "that you should know I am an extremely rigorous editor of other people's thinking. I will not simply agree with you because it is easier." The smile that crossed his face was slow and genuine and reached all the way to his eyes in a way she had not yet seen from him. "I was rather counting on that," he said. Newport did not erupt. It did something more effective than that. It applied pressure, the slow, steady, nearly invisible kind that does not announce itself as cruelty because it arrives dressed as concern, as practicality, as the reasonable counsel of people who have seen how these things tend to go. The kind of pressure that leaves no visible mark because it never quite touches you directly, working instead on the air around you until the air itself becomes difficult to move through. It began, as these things usually did, with the women. Mrs. Hargrove called on Nora 3 days after the Wednesday evening in the library, arriving at Thames Street in the middle of the morning with the punctuality of someone who had planned the visit carefully and the social ease of someone who intended it to appear spontaneous. She browsed the front shelves for several minutes with genuine interest before settling into conversation with the unhurried grace of a woman who had been navigating difficult social terrain for 40 years and had not once lost her footing. She did not say anything unkind. She was far too skilled for that. What she said, in the warm and slightly confidential register she reserved for women she was treating as equals, was that she had always admired Nora's independence, her intelligence, the dignified way she had built a life from circumstances that might have defeated a lesser woman. She said that Everett Ashworth was, by every measure, a remarkable man, serious, principled, genuinely accomplished, and that his recent behavior had surprised everyone who knew him, herself included, in ways that were not without their charm. She said that she hoped, as a friend to both of them, that they would each think carefully about what they were doing, because the world, as lovely as its exceptions could occasionally be, had a long memory for arrangements that did not resolve themselves in the expected directions. She left 20 minutes later, having purchased a volume of Edith Wharton she likely already owned and having said nothing that could be quoted against her. Nora stood in the empty shop after she left and understood with perfect clarity that she had just been warned. The second pressure came through Daniel, who arrived at the library that same evening with the expression of a man carrying weight he had not asked for and did not know how to set down. He had been approached at his club by 2 separate men whose business connections overlapped with Everett's in ways that were not incidental, and the conversations, while oblique, had carried an unmistakable subtext, that Nora's association with Ashworth was being watched, that the watching was not neutral, and that certain parties had an interest in how it resolved. "I'm not asking you to end it," Daniel said carefully, sitting across from her at the desk where Everett had placed his open hand a week prior. "I am asking you to understand that it has consequences I cannot entirely protect you from." "You never could protect me from the consequences of being who I am," she said, not unkindly. "That was always outside your jurisdiction." Her brother looked at her for a long moment. "You're happy," he said finally, as though arriving at an unexpected diagnosis. "I am being careful," she replied. "That's not what I asked." She did not answer him directly, which was, he knew well enough to recognize, its own kind of answer. The third pressure was the one that cost her the most, because it came from a direction she had not fully anticipated. Margaret Ellison was Nora's oldest friend, a woman of her own age and similar circumstances who ran a small art restoration practice out of a studio on Marlborough Street and who had been, for the better part of 15 years, the person Nora trusted most completely with the unedited version of her inner life. Margaret had a precise mind, a low tolerance for self-deception, and a loyalty so reliable it had never once required acknowledgement between them. She came on a Saturday morning, brought coffee from the bakery 2 doors down, and sat in the back room with her feet tucked under her in the way she always sat when she intended to say something important. "Tell me what's actually happening," Margaret said. Nora told her. All of it, without the careful framings she had been using with everyone else. The measured language, the qualified statements, the practiced expressions of appropriate uncertainty. She told her about the Hargrove ball and the Jewett novel and the Tuesday visits and the Wednesday evening and his hand on the table and the smile that reached his eyes and the way the word vespertine had opened something in her chest that she had believed permanently sealed. Margaret listened without interrupting, which was the greatest gift she could have offered. When Nora finished, Margaret was quiet for a moment, looking at her coffee cup. "I'm going to tell you something you won't want to hear," she said. Not because I doubt him. I have no basis for doubting him. But because I know you. Go ahead, Nora said. You have spent 20 years making yourself very small in rooms that didn't want you, Margaret said. And you have been so disciplined about it, so genuinely graceful about it, that I think you have stopped being able to tell the difference between genuine smallness and the performance of it. Between accepting your limits and choosing them. She looked up. I am not worried about Everett Ashworth hurting you. I am worried about you hurting yourself by deciding, before he has given you any reason to, that you are not enough for this. The sentence landed in the room with the particular weight of a truth that has been true for a long time and has simply been waiting for the right moment to be spoken aloud. Nora looked at her friend. When did you get so perceptive? I have always been this perceptive, Margaret replied. You have always been this stubborn. It was 3 days after that conversation that the title of the evening finally arrived. The moment the story had been quietly building toward since the first notes of the Hargrove Orchestra had drifted across the August lawn. The occasion was the Delafield reception, held in the grand drawing room of the Delafield cottage on Ocean Drive. A gathering of 60 guests assembled to mark the engagement of the Delafield's eldest daughter to a young man from a Boston banking family. It was not an event Nora would ordinarily have attended. The invitation had come through Everett, extended formally and correctly through a note that arrived at the library 3 days prior, asking whether she would accompany him. She had gone. Not without hesitation, not without the familiar internal preparation she always undertook before entering rooms that required it. The straightening of the spine, the calibration of composure, the quiet internal instruction to meet whatever came with steadiness rather than retreat. But she had gone. The early part of the evening had proceeded without significant incident. Everett remained close, introducing her to the guests he knew with a natural ease that neither overclaimed her position nor obscured it, finding the precise register that said clearly, "This person matters to me," without requiring the room's permission to mean it. It was Mrs. Alderton who forced the issue. Clara Alderton was a woman of 62 whose social authority in Newport derived from a combination of old money, a long memory, and the particular confidence of someone who had never once been asked to justify her right to be in a room. She had 3 unmarried daughters of diminishing prospects and a manner that could shift without warning from charm to surgical precision, often within the same sentence. She approached Nora during a moment when Everett had stepped briefly aside to speak with the Delafield patriarch, positioning herself with the practiced ease of someone who had timed the approach carefully. "Miss Caldwell," she said warmly, "I don't believe we've had the pleasure, though of course I know who you are. The lending library, isn't it?" "That's right," Nora replied. "How industrious," Mrs. Alderton said, in the tone that made industrious mean something other than a compliment. "I imagine it provides such a useful service for the summer visitors. Tell me," and here her voice dropped to the intimate register of someone sharing a confidence, "are you here this evening as a guest, or are you perhaps assisting with some of the evening's arrangements? I only ask because I know the Delafields sometimes engage local." "She is here as my guest, Clara." The voice came from directly behind Nora, even unhurried, carrying the full weight of a man who had never once needed to raise it to be heard. Every conversation within a 10-foot radius stopped. Everett stepped forward to stand beside Nora. Not in front of her, not as a shield between her and the room, but beside her, shoulder to shoulder, his position making its meaning plain without requiring a single additional word. He looked at Mrs. Alderton with an expression of perfect, impenetrable courtesy. "I believe you know Miss Nora Caldwell," he said. "One of the most well-read people in Newport and quite possibly the most honest. Both qualities I find invaluable." He paused for exactly 1 beat. "I trust you'll excuse us. I promise to introduce her to the Delafields before the evening gets away from us." He offered Nora his arm. She took it. As they moved away through the crowd, she was aware of the silence spreading in concentric rings behind them, the sound of 60 people simultaneously recalibrating everything they thought they knew about the situation. She kept her chin level, her steps unhurried, her expression composed. Beneath his sleeve, she could feel the steadiness of his arm. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly, when they had reached a quieter corner of the room. She considered the question honestly, which was the only way she knew how to consider anything. "Yes," she said. And then, because it was true and because he had earned her truths by now, "Thank you." He looked at her with the directness that was simply how he looked at things. "You never need to thank me for that," he said. "That will always be the easiest thing I do." The party continued around them. The music resumed. The 60 guests redistributed themselves and their conversations and found new things to discuss, as people always did. But something had changed in the room's understanding of itself, and everyone inside it, including Nora, knew it. They were married in November, when Newport had emptied of its summer people and returned to itself. The ceremony was small by the standards his position might have demanded, 30 guests in a white-clapboard church 3 blocks from the water, the kind of church that smelled of old wood and candle wax and the particular solemnity of a building that had witnessed enough human occasions to have developed its own quiet dignity. Nora wore deep green, not white, which caused a brief flutter of commentary among the few society correspondents who felt obligated to note it, and which she had chosen precisely because it was the color she felt most herself in, and she had decided, with a clarity that arrived sometime between the Whitmore garden and the Wednesday evening in the library, that feeling most herself was no longer a luxury she was willing to treat as optional. Everett, standing at the front of the church as she came down the short aisle on Daniel's arm, looked at her with an expression so unguarded that Margaret, seated in the second row, leaned over to the marine painter beside her and whispered that she had never in her life seen that man's face do that before. The vows they exchanged were the standard ones. The meaning they carried was not standard at all. Afterward, at the small reception held in the library, Nora's insistence, Everett's immediate agreement, the 30 guests moved between the shelves with glasses of champagne, and the room that had witnessed so much of the story's quiet interior life held its final chapter with the same unhurried generosity it had always offered. Daniel gave a toast that was brief and sincere and ended with his voice doing something he had not planned for it to do. Margaret did not give a toast but caught Nora's eye across the room at one point and held it for a moment that said everything a toast could have said and several things a toast could not. Everett, standing beside his wife in the room full of her books, looked like a man who had arrived somewhere he had not known he was trying to reach. The first year of their marriage was not without its difficulties, and the story would not be honest if it pretended otherwise. Society adjusted as it always did, but adjustment was not the same as acceptance, and there were drawing rooms in Newport and New York that remained closed to Nora in ways they would not have been closed to a different kind of duchess. A younger one, a wealthier one whose origins fit more neatly inside the expected narrative. There were dinners where she felt the old familiar weight of a room that had already decided about her before she arrived. There were women who were perfectly civil in ways that were perfectly designed to remind her of the precise distance between civility and welcome. She did not pretend these things away. She had spent too many years being honest with herself to start lying now. What was different was that she no longer faced them alone, and, more importantly, that she no longer faced them as someone who had accepted the room's verdict as final. The woman who had stood in the Hargrove entrance hall 2 Augusts ago and braced herself for a door that would not quite open had been replaced, not by someone harder or more defended, but by someone more fully inhabited. She took up more space now. Not in the aggressive sense, not loudly or pointedly, but in the simple, uncomplicated sense of a person who had stopped apologizing for the space they occupied. Everett noticed. He noticed most things about her, which she had come to understand was simply how he was, attentive in the way of someone for whom attention was not a social performance but a genuine orientation toward the world. "You handled Mrs. Alderton differently tonight," he said one evening, after a reception they had attended in Providence, the woman having appeared there in what seemed a determined effort to make herself a recurring feature of their social landscape. "I didn't handle her at all," Nora replied. Hanging her coat on the stand near the door of the house they had made their primary Newport residence. "I simply stopped making room for her to decide how I should feel about being in the room." Everett regarded her with that particular expression she had catalogued by now as his version of being impressed. When did that happen? She thought about it genuinely. "Gradually," she said, "and then all at once." The library on Thames Street remained open. This had been, for some of Newport society, one of the more bewildering aspects of the arrangement, that a woman who had married into one of the most substantial fortunes on the eastern seaboard continued to spend 4 mornings a week behind the front desk of a modest lending library, cataloging arrivals and recommending volumes to summer visitors and maintaining her subscription accounts with the same careful attention she had always given them. Everett had not suggested otherwise. He had, in fact, arranged for the library's lease to be secured for the next decade, an act of practical support so quiet and so precisely calibrated to what she actually needed that she had sat with the news for a full 10 minutes before she trusted herself to speak about it. "You didn't ask me," she said finally. "You would have argued against it," he replied, from behind the book he was reading, on the grounds that it was too much or unnecessary, or some other form of the same argument you make whenever someone does something that suggests you deserve to have your life supported rather than merely tolerated. She had looked at him for a long moment. "I'm working on that," she said. "I know," he replied. "I have a great deal of patience." The library became, in the years that followed, something more than it had been, less a refuge and more a genuine institution, the kind of place that accumulated meaning the way certain rooms do, through the accumulation of all the hours spent honestly inside them. Nora expanded the collection, developed a correspondence program with authors she had long admired, and began a small monthly lecture series that drew, to her permanent astonishment, people who drove from Providence and Boston specifically to attend. Everett came to every lecture. He sat in the back row, which she had told him was unnecessary, and which he continued to do anyway, reading until the room filled and then closing his book and listening to his wife discuss literature and ideas with the audience that had found its way to her with an attention so steady it was almost indistinguishable from pride. It was Margaret who said it best, as she usually did. They were sitting on the back porch of Nora's Newport house on a late September afternoon 2 years into the marriage, drinking tea while the light did its slow amber work across the garden Nora had been gradually coaxing into something she was happy with. The summer people had gone. The town had settled back into its true self. The ocean was audible from the porch, not loudly, but persistently, the way things that have always been there tend to make themselves known. "Do you remember," Margaret said, "what you told me the morning after the Hargrove ball? Before any of this. Before the book and the library visits and the garden lecture." "Vaguely," Nora said, which was not entirely true. "You said you had braced yourself for the usual indifference." Margaret wrapped both hands around her cup. "I've been thinking about that, about what it costs a person to spend years bracing themselves. How much energy goes into the bracing that could have gone somewhere else entirely." Nora looked out at the garden. "It was necessary, though," she said. "At the time. It was," Margaret agreed. "And then it wasn't anymore. And you noticed the difference." She paused. "That's the part most people don't do. They keep bracing long after the blow has stopped coming, because the bracing has become so familiar it feels like protection when it's actually just a habit." The ocean moved below them, patient and indifferent and continuous. "What stopped yours?" Margaret asked. Nora considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Being seen," she said finally. "Not saved. Not chosen in the way that implies someone else determined my value. Just seen. By someone who looked directly and didn't flinch and didn't need me to be something other than what I was." She paused. "It's remarkable what you're able to stop bracing against once that happens. There is something this story understands about time that is worth sitting with before it ends." Nora Caldwell spent the first 38 years of her life being told, in the accumulated language of 1,000 small dismissals, that the most significant chapters behind her, that the rooms worth being in had already been entered by the people who deserved to enter them, and that she had been measured by those rooms and found to be something less than sufficient. She believed it, the way you come to believe things that are repeated to you with enough consistency and enough social authority that the repetition begins to feel like evidence. And then she stopped believing it, not because someone swept in and rescued her from the belief, but because she encountered, in the back corner of a ballroom she had barely wanted to attend, an honest conversation about a book placed on the wrong shelf. And that conversation led to another, and gradually, in the accumulated honesty of all those exchanges, she discovered something that no room had ever been large enough to tell her, that she had always been sufficient, that the rooms had been wrong, that the most important measure of a person's worth has never been whether the world noticed them at the right moment, but whether they remained, through all the years of not being noticed, genuinely and recognizably themselves. She had, against considerable pressure and with no particular reward for doing so, She had remained curious, honest, precise, capable of vespertine and wild indigo and the exact placement of a book on a shelf where it would finally be found by someone who knew what it was. You may have your own version of her story. Perhaps the room that dismissed you was a different kind of room, a workplace, a family gathering, a relationship that required you to make yourself smaller to survive it. Perhaps the years of bracing have become so habitual that you have stopped noticing the tension they require of you. Perhaps you have made peace, as Nora once did, with a set of limits you have simply stopped testing. The story does not ask you to stop being careful. It asks only that you consider the difference between caution and resignation, between protecting yourself and disappearing yourself, between waiting for the right moment and understanding that you are already in it. Nora did not become worthy of being seen when Everett Ashworth looked at her across a ballroom. She was already worthy. She had always been worthy. The only thing that changed was that someone finally looked. And then, slowly, stubbornly, with the particular grace of a woman who had kept faith with herself through 2 decades of being underestimated, so did she. Subscribe, like, and turn on the notification bell for more stories, and comment where you're from. I'd love to know.